Good evening, everyone. Hello there. We have a lively crowd tonight, which is great because we have some lively guests tonight as well. So we're going to have a good time. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Radecki. It's my pleasure to serve as your director here at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. Yes, that's a mouthful, but it's a role that I'm really, really proud to hold. And I'm so glad to see all of you here. We have Hauenstein Center members. If you don't know what that is, come and ask us afterwards. We have members from our partner this evening from the Grand Rapids Bar Association, so welcome to all of you. And of course, members of our Cook Leadership Academy, shout out to you all, and students and faculty from Grand Valley as well, and our community. Thank you all for being here. It's going to be a really wonderful program. There's a quote that goes, "Presidents come and go, but the Supreme Court goes on forever." Anyone know which president said that? That would be William Howard Taft, our 27th president and 10th Chief Justice, and now some of you are nodding accordingly. The gravity of this statement leads us to tonight's program, where we'll focus our attention on this most important judicial body and the cases that are before them on the current docket. As a reminder, our programming is designed to educate and inform, not to declare who is right and wrong. It's designed to help us engage and think more deeply with one another in person, which we think is always a good thing. And it's meant to spur us to act in ways that lead to a better world for everyone, not just the groups that we personally identify with. You all know the mission of the Hauenstein Center is to raise a community of ethical and effective leaders for the 21st century. And we're so appreciative of all of you being here tonight, acting in a way that leads toward that outcome. So thank you all for being here. I might remind us that one of the ways the Hauenstein Center works towards an outcome of ethical and effective leadership is through the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. That is the program that we have for Grand Valley students, undergrad, all the way through some of our doctorate programs. It's a very intensive, essentially 9-month program that takes some of our best and brightest students on a journey through self-discovery, understanding what leadership means to them, what it means to the communities they belong in, and what it means to the world. I'm really always very proud to say that I was part of the second cohort ever of the Cook Leadership Academy, so hopefully I'm proof that it works, I guess. But with that, we are always proud to highlight one of our students when we do our programs. And tonight I'm really proud to introduce you to Michaela Anderson. And I'd love to tell you a little bit about her. Michaela Anderson is currently pursuing a Master of Public Administration at GVSU. She brings 9 years of expertise in sustainable business practices to her current position as Senior Sustainability Specialist at Preferred by Nature, a global nonprofit working to drive sustainable impact for people, nature, and climate. Michaela serves as co-chair of her precinct's local and general elections, where she applies her commitment to civic engagement and organizational leadership to support the democratic process in her community. And as a former municipal official, I can't underscore how important it is to have good, ethical, and effective leaders running your local elections. So we especially want to thank Michaela for that. But without further ado, let's all give a round of applause as Michaela comes up here.
Thank you, Megan. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you to Mr. Ramoser and Professor Foley for sharing their time and expertise on the pivotal Supreme Court cases in the upcoming term. To begin, I'd like you to turn to your neighbor and share an activity that you practiced this week, maybe meditation, or reading, or yoga, or even cooking dinner. Thank you. Quite a good discussion this evening, I think. Thank you all for sharing. I ask this because democracy, too, is something we practice. There are many ways to practice democracy, such as understanding court cases, knowing your rights, engaging in media literacy, and most importantly, voting. As Megan mentioned, my own favorite expression of democracy is serving as co-chair for my local precinct's elections. It's an illuminating experience to stand alongside fellow citizens who come to cast their votes for the lawmakers who represent our interests. Through this work, I've learned that in Michigan, we have about 1,500 jurisdictions, each with 4 to 8 election workers. Altogether, a single election day could require upwards of 15,000 election workers in our state alone. And every election fills me with energy because I get to work alongside people with many political viewpoints, and yet we are united by a shared commitment to ensuring that democracy and the right to vote remains accessible to all. Through these experiences, I've learned that leadership is not about standing apart, but about creating conditions for others to participate fully. I encourage you to find your own democratic practice and incorporate that into your life, just as you would a sport, a faith, or a skill you hope to master. My name is Michaela Anderson, and I am proud to be one of many who practice leadership through democracy. Thank you. And for today's practice, I'm delighted to introduce this evening Mr. Remoser and Professor Foley. I will offer a brief biography for each speaker and encourage you to reference the event program for more details. Elizabeth Price Foley is a founding member of the Florida International University College of Law, where she teaches constitutional law, separation of powers, and civil procedure. Presently, she serves as partner in Holtzman Vogel, PLLC, where she practices constitutional, political, and appellate law. James Remoser serves as the legal editor at Politico. Before joining Politico, he served as the editor of SCOTUS blog. He has previously written a weekly column on legal affairs for the National Journal, and he worked as a reporter covering health law for Inside Health Policy. Our moderator, Mark Richards, is a professor in the GVSU Department of Political Science, where he served as department chair for 12 years. Dr. Richards teaches courses in constitutional law and human rights. In his role as pre-law advisor, he has assisted countless GVSU students on their path to law school. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth, James, and Mark to the stage.
Well, welcome everyone. It's just such a thrill and an honor to be up here on stage tonight with James and Elizabeth for what promises to be a very interesting, wide-ranging discussion. I'd like to just briefly thank Megan, Kaler as well from the Hauenstein Center, who put a lot of effort into planning this event. Obviously, it's very timely. As you may know, the Supreme Court begins its oral arguments of the new term on Monday. And there are quite a few cases on the docket, quite a few important cases, and the emergency docket has been very active as well. So I've asked Megan if we could extend tonight's event for 4 hours. She said no, unfortunately, so we're going to do our best in the time allotted. I'm just so thrilled to see this great turnout tonight. I assume that we're all here because we do share the common ground of belief in our Constitution. And of course, as you know, our legal system is an adversarial system. In many important Supreme Court cases, there are both majority and dissenting opinions. And so hopefully tonight we can highlight some important legal disagreements. And I also know with this audience, we always get great questions during Q&A. So I'll reserve a healthy amount of time for that, and we certainly invite your perspectives during that period as well. All right, so having said that, let's just jump right into it. We're going to start out with tariffs, a topic that is on many people's minds these days. We have two cases, Learning Resources versus Trump, coming out of the U.S. District Court for D.C., And then that has been consolidated with Trump versus VOS selections, which comes out of the Court of International Trade and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. So I'm going to start with you, Elizabeth, and if you could just tell us a little bit about what's going on in these cases, what are the issues, what's at stake?
Okay, so the case for the most part is a statutory case rather than a constitutional case. It involves a federal law called the IEEPA or the IEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It was passed in the 1970s, and it's a statute that, as the name suggests, is where Congress is giving to the president rather fulsome authority to take a wide swath of action in the event that there is an economic emergency. And specifically, the statute talks about how the president can declare an emergency if it's an unusual and extraordinary emergency. But that emergency that's unusual and extraordinary has to emanate from a foreign source. And then once he declares that emergency under the Act, he is given expressly by the Act the ability to regulate importation of goods from foreign sources, as long as there is some concern about national security, foreign affairs, or harm to the economy, right? So it's a statute that gives the president incredibly broad emergency authority, but it's only, unusual and extraordinary emergencies emanating from foreign sources that relate to national security, foreign affairs, or economics, and it does give him the ability to sort of regulate importation. So his argument, the Trump administration's argument, is that we're in that emergency now. That although we've always had, or at least in recent decades, we've had a trade imbalance. The trade imbalance, if you look at the chart, just historically what it is, has really gone up significantly in recent years. And he said that trade imbalance is causing not just an economic emergency, but a national security, foreign affairs emergency, in the sense that the imbalance is creating a problem with our critical supply industries. Industries relating, for example, to defense, relating to pharmaceuticals, relating to food, agriculture. And he says, because we have such a trade imbalance, we're not as good at producing food anymore, we're not as good at producing pharmaceuticals, we're not as good at producing steel and other sort of defense-associated industries. And that's a problem should we ever be in a situation of war. It's making this country weaker and vulnerable in a national security sense. So he says, I want to have tariffs to restore balance in trade, to make that sort of emergency subside. And then the question is, whether he can do that under the statute. The statute itself is broadly worded. I gave you the language of it, and it seems to support the imposition of tariffs, because tariffs would be a regulation of importation. And then the primary argument that was made here was that, a tariff is more like a raising of a tax. It is a species of tax. And there are specific statutes out there that deal with just tariffs. And so the question is, did Congress mean to give the president sort of a new, sort of fulsome authority to impose tariffs in these specific situations? Again, the plain text seems to support that. And so the biggest constitutional arguments are as follows. One is that the majority in the Federal Court of Claims said there's this thing called the major question doctrine. Major question doctrine is a doctrine that the Supreme Court relatively recently has recognized, and it's grounded in separation of powers. And what it says is that if an administrative agency writes a regulation, and that regulation is a sort of capacious construction of statutory language that has never been thought of before and seems to create tremendous new power without specifically saying so, that we will not allow those administrative agencies to write those kinds of regulations. Those kind of significant political or economic decisions have to be made by Congress and Congress alone. The way the court has sort of colloquially described the doctrine is that the Congress does not hide elephants in mouse holes. And so the argument is that that's what's going on here, that the IEPA does not give the president this sort of new grand tariff authority, and we should strike it down, said the majority, as a major question doctrine. The problem with that conceptually is that the major question doctrine has never been applied in the realm of foreign affairs. It's always been domestic policy. So in recent years, for example, 3 of President Biden's executive actions got struck down under the major questions doctrine. His OSHA vaccine, COVID vaccine mandate, his eviction moratorium, the landlord eviction moratorium that he imposed under the, what even act did he even use for that?
I don't remember.
It was so far afield.
It was a COVID era emergency
statute of some sort. Yeah, it was really far afield. So they struck that one down too. And then the other one was his student loan bailout that he tried under the HEROES Act, which was a post 9/11 type first responder act. And so the MQD, the major questions has been used a lot. And the question is, can you apply it to the president? And in particular, can you apply it to the president in the realm of foreign affairs, where the president himself has independent Article II constitutional authority over foreign affairs? So that's where the constitutional focus, I think, is on that case. But I do think the case is likely to be resolved on just statutory construction grounds.
Okay, so just picking up on that, and I'll turn to you, James. Could you just talk a little bit more about the foreign policy dimension that Elizabeth just highlighted? I mean, to what extent does the Supreme Court owe the president more deference because tariffs fall into the category of foreign policy?
Yeah, I think it's definitely true that the Supreme Court has said many times that the president has broader latitude in the area of foreign affairs than in ordinary domestic policy. And that's, of course, because we think that the president is best equipped to manage foreign relations. And I think one important question in this case about the legality of Trump's sweeping global tariffs is whether you think of tariffs as a foreign policy, an element of foreign policy, or whether it's a garden variety economic policy. And I think the conception of how you frame that question will be lurking in the background of this case, because some important swing votes on the court, particularly Brett Kavanaugh, have signaled that they are willing to give the president more discretion, less oversight in the area of foreign affairs. On the other hand, I think that, just to put my legal realist hat on, if you look at the records of all 6 of the conservative justices on the Supreme Court, I think what you'll find is that they traditionally have ruled in favor of businesses and in favor of the free market. And I think that the conservative justices, all of them, frankly, come from a legal and ideological tradition that is very different than the MAGA movement right now in regards to its views of economic policy. And I think the 6 conservative justices are sort of naturally inclined to support policies that are more pro-free market. And these tariffs certainly are not that. Now, I don't think they're going to write any of that in the opinion. And I do think that this will come down on paper to a question of statutory interpretation and whether this 1970s law really does authorize tariffs when it uses the word regulate. But I think some of these ideological commitments from the justices are going to be lurking in the background. I think it's very interesting that this case in particular sort of involves a conflict between 2 core ideological convictions of the conservative majority. On one hand, deference to the president, a willingness to grant robust presidential power in the area of foreign affairs particularly. That's on the one hand, that's one conviction. And on the other hand, I think a sort of predilection toward favoring free markets and less meddling in the economy. And these tariffs are, frankly, an unprecedented policy of meddling in the economy. And so It's going to be interesting. I don't see this case coming down along the stark usual ideological 6-3 divide. It's being argued at the court just a month from now on a highly expedited schedule. And it's going to be a big one because this really is the centerpiece of Donald Trump's economic agenda. He campaigned on imposing very, very strict tariffs. If the court rules against him and strikes down these tariffs, it's very likely that the US government is going to have to pay massive amounts of money in refunds from the tariffs it has already collected. And it's very interesting to see whether the Supreme Court is going to be willing to curb, restrict, or even strike down entirely such a pillar of Trump's economic agenda and what he campaigned on.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
I think you make a lot of really good points, actually. I mean, especially the point about sort of the ideological tension with the conservatives on the court, and they are a broad range of justices. They're definitely not uniform in their approach. But one of the things that I'm wondering is, if you look at that act, just the title of it, International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and it does specifically talk about sort of an emergency relating to the economy, not just national security and foreign affairs. Is that language of that statute and the recognition that Congress is sort of giving to the president this sort of enormous power to regulate the economy in a way that he normally could not, right? That sort of broad delegation of the president over the economy. I mean, for example, one of the most common consequences of IEPA historically has been the freezing of assets. So IEPA is sort of just inherently economic. How do you think that affects their ideology about free markets or their assessment?
Well, I think it depends on, like you said, it will boil down to how broad they think the delegation in IEPA is.
Right.
I mean, of course, as most of you likely know, the Constitution itself gives the power to tax and to impose tariffs to Congress. It's in Article 1 of the Constitution. Congress has the power to impose tariffs. The president does not have any inherent tariff authority. So in order for the president to be able to do it, he has to point to some congressional authorization. Did IEPA authorize that? I mean, you seem to suggest that the language is quite clear. Right. I mean, 3 lower courts ruled the other way and said the IEPA does not authorize tariffs. And it's a question of whether that word regulate imports, means the ability to actually tax imports.
I mean, I agree, but at the same time, I mean, these were not unanimous decisions below,
for sure.
right?
No,
so we've got good arguments on both sides, and
definitely good arguments on both sides.
That's the question. I mean, do you go with a more textualist approach, right?
Wouldn't a textualist approach require having the T word in the statute?
No.
IEPA does not mention the word tariff.
Definitely
You would think
not.
if Congress was trying to delegate tariffs, they might use that word in the statute. At least that's the view of the challengers, I should say.
I mean, I wouldn't think so, but that's because IEPA is not about tariffs. I mean, if you have like the Tariff Act, if you have a Tariff Act, you're going to have to use the T word. But if you pass a statute that's just about emergencies qua emergencies that affect certain areas that emanate from foreign sources, you're very likely not to use the T word. You're very likely to use more generic language.
To account for unforeseen circumstances.
Right, because you don't know what that emergency is going to look like in the future. So I can see them, not putting the T word in there, but tariffs still being encompassed within the broad language. But I hear you. I mean, I think there's some concern. He just raised the issue of non-delegation, which is another kind of swimming constitutional issue in this case. And that's a doctrine that basically says Congress can't delegate its lawmaking power, right? If there's any lawmaking, it has to come from Congress and not the president. Of course, the problem is we live in 2025, and we know that a lot of things that look a lot like law and feel a lot like law are emanating these days from the executive branch, unfortunately. The Supreme Court used to have a doctrine called the non-delegation doctrine, but it hasn't been used since 1937, where they would strike down statutes as delegating too much law-like authority to the executive branch. And I just don't see them having the appetite dive into that, because that's a whole, Pandora's box of sticky issues. Like, how do you know when too much delegation, when do you cross the line into too much delegation? If you're too aggressive on that, you could bring down the entire administrative state, and there just hasn't been enough briefing on it. So.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think it's just going to come down ultimately to the reading of the statute. There's no need to go into non-delegation doctrine, although obviously it's kind of lurking in the background. Yeah. So I'm going to just wrap this one up by saying stay tuned. Oral arguments November 5th. It's going to be a good one. All right, so from there, we are going to just jump right into free speech. And James, I'll start with you. We're going to talk a little bit about Childs versus Salazar. So this is a case that's coming out of Colorado, and it comes to us in light of another decision from the previous term, U.S. versus Skermeti, where the Supreme Court upheld Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care. But what we're talking about here is Colorado has banned something they're calling conversion therapy. So tell us a little bit about what Colorado's trying to do, and basically, is this case a regulation of speech or is it a regulation of conduct?
Yeah, that will be the primary question, I think. This case is coming up even faster than the tariffs case. It's being argued literally next week. And it's one of a couple cases this term where the Supreme Court will be sort of wading back in to the culture wars and deciding cases that really do implicate the rights of LGBTQ Americans. And Mark, you're right, like this involves a challenge to a Colorado state law on what the state calls conversion therapy. A number of other states have similar laws. And what Colorado says it's trying to do with this law is prohibit therapy and counseling for minors that encourages them to either convert their sexuality from gay or lesbian to straight, or encourages them to convert or change their gender identity from transgender to cisgender. That's what Colorado says it's trying to do. The plaintiff who brought the challenge to that law brought a challenge under the First Amendment free speech clause. She's a Christian counselor who offers counseling and therapy and would like to counsel her clients. She does not say that she is trying to counsel them to convert their sexuality or change their sexuality or gender identity. I think her argument is that she wants to offer counseling that can encourage clients to eliminate unwanted sexual thoughts or to help them, in her words, feel comfortable in the bodies that God gave them. But she thinks that if she offers such counseling to teenagers, she will run afoul of the Colorado ban on conversion therapy. And she says that that ban violates the First Amendment because it suppresses her speech. Talk therapy, counseling, is simply the act of speaking. The First Amendment generally prohibits the government from restricting people's speech with a variety of different complicated constitutional legal tests that are used to analyze laws that do that. But she essentially brought a First Amendment challenge and said that the law is unconstitutional as applied to her. So that is the case that the Supreme Court will be hearing. As Mark previewed, I do think the decision will hinge on whether the Supreme Court views the Colorado law and similar state laws as prohibiting speech or simply as regulating the practice of therapy. And of course, very often, the two things can be intermingled. And I think recently, the Supreme Court has not been receptive to challenges from pro-trans litigants seeking to vindicate rights. In the Skermeti case, as Mark mentioned, the court in a 6-3 ruling upheld a state ban on gender-affirming care for minors. And I would say that I don't think the court is going to be receptive to the arguments of Colorado and similarly situated states here.
Elizabeth, do you want to add a?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely framed the case perfectly. It's going to come down to, is this a regulation of a profession, which is what Colorado argues, or is this a regulation of speech? On that issue, I do think if you just play a couple of mind experiments, you say, okay, well, could for example, a state tell lawyers that they couldn't advocate for a certain position in court, or that they couldn't counsel their clients on bankruptcy, or just whatever, pick your favorite topic. And although it would be a regulation of the profession, of course, that doesn't insulate it from First Amendment concerns or First Amendment issues being raised by the regulation of profession. So here, when you have a statute that says you as a licensed counselor cannot talk to your client in this way, with this goal in mind, whether she's doing it or not, I think that's a fascinating question. But if that's the thrust of the statute, you can't talk to your client with this goal in mind, then it looks a lot and feels a lot like viewpoint discrimination. Viewpoint discrimination is considered verboten. I mean, it's one of the most forbidden things you can do, is stop someone from expressing a viewpoint under the free speech clause. That's going to trigger strict scrutiny. It's going to be presumptively unconstitutional. And I think that's what they're going to do. Because I don't think Colorado has articulated, if it wants to survive some sort of heightened scrutiny, it hasn't articulated what its sort of compelling government interest would be here. Not that maybe they couldn't, but I don't know what it would be. But
I mean, we should voice the argument of Colorado, and I think their argument is that these types of conversion therapies are quite harmful to minors, and they have evidence for that, and so that is the evidence that they have put forward. But I think that you are right. This is a very pro-free speech court, especially in contexts like this, and I think they'll be quite hostile to this Colorado law.
And it's interesting too, because the court in recent years, starting sort of with the late abortion cases pre-Dobbs, has been very clear that when there's like a medical issue, and it was raised in Scarametti as well, when there's a medical issue and there's difference of opinion about whether something's harmful or not harmful, they don't defer to the experts.
That's right.
But they take a fresh look themselves. And so I think that also bodes poorly, I think, for Colorado in that case.
Okay, well, we could spend a lot more time on this, but in the interest of trying to cover as much as possible, now we're going to move on to equal protection. And Elizabeth, I'll start with you in a case called West Virginia versus BPJ. So West Virginia passed a law called the Save Women's Sports Act. So tell us a little bit about what's going on in this case.
Yeah, this is another one of those sort of transgender women's sports cases. There were two of them initially that the Supreme Court was going to look at. One of them looks like it's mooted out at this point. But this one involves a middle school student who was born male and has begun hormone replacement to transition, and wants to play, I think, unspecified sports. I'm not sure which sport it was. In the Idaho case, it was track and field, but I think this one's just, I want to play on the girls' sports teams. And it raises an issue under the Civil Rights Act, Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, which is the part of the Civil Rights Act that deals with educational institutions. And it prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. And what's interesting about this case is that not too long ago, I don't remember the year of Bostock, there was a case called Bostock, which involved a different title of the Civil Rights Act, Title VII, which involves employment discrimination. And in Bostock, Justice Gorsuch, for a majority of the court, wrote an opinion saying that Title VII's prohibition of discrimination on the basis of sex, same language, meant that employers could not discriminate against trans individuals. Because the idea was that if you are an employer and you don't like a trans person who's presenting as as the opposite gender or engaging in sort of behavior that you would associate normally with the opposite gender, that when they take that adverse employment action against that person, it is on the basis of their sex. So if you're a male who's, let's say, transitioning to female and you're wearing female clothes or acting to female, then the point was you wouldn't have been fired for that activity, but for the fact that you are a biological male, and therefore it is discrimination on the basis of sex to fire that biological male for acting sort of to female or presenting to female. That was the logical structure of Bostock. And it was a very textual decision by Gorsuch. Gorsuch is probably the primary textualist on the court right now. And he just sort of very carefully sort of walked through what does on the basis of sex mean. And that was the conclusion. And so if that's the conclusion in Title VII, then the issue is, why wouldn't it also be the conclusion in Title IX? The argument that is being made is that Title IX is unique because if you read Title IX, it's not super long, but it clearly talks about like biological sex. So for example, it allows educational institutions to have boys' state and girls' state. Have you ever heard of boys and girls' state? You know, that whole thing where they do a little convention. And Boy Scouts and Girls.
I was a kid.
I
went to Boy State.
Yeah, it was great.
All right,
I didn't know
that
if I
makes
was
all
dating
three
myself.
of us, so yeah, all right.
And then, you know, Boy Scout groups and Girl Scout groups and what's the other, Campfire Girls. And those are actually mentioned in the text of Title IX. And then Title IX also has a special provision that talks about how educational institutions can basically have segregated living facilities, boys' dorms, girls' dorms, and the like. And then it doesn't say anything about bathrooms or sports, right? And so what's interesting is after Title IX was put into law, there were regulations issued by the Department of Justice, which administers the law. And the regulations are where you find the discussion about sports and bathrooms. And the regs have long said, okay, if you can have segregated living facilities, we're going to construe living facilities to include sort of the lesser portions of living facilities, including bathrooms. And then, of course, sports, the history of Title IX is equality of opportunity of women to have their own sports because they can't generally compete effectively with men in things like soccer and football and basketball. So there's a different history, there's some different text in Title IX, and I literally have no idea how that case is going to come out, especially given Bostock. The one thing I do know is, for example, Barrett, who was not on the court in Bostock, I think kind of signaled clearly in her Schermetti concurrence that she's willing to look at Title IX differently. I don't know about Gorsuch, and I don't know about Kavanaugh, and I don't know about Roberts. I mean, that's just where it's going to come down. Can they, you know, on a principled basis, make a distinction between Title VII and Title IX based on the history and some of that textual stuff, even though on the basis of sex is exactly the same between the two?
I'll hazard a prediction
Okay.
if you're unwilling to.
I was going to ask you to, if, yeah.
I'm just not sure about it.
This case is going to come down 6-3 along the usual ideological lines against the transgender plaintiffs. That's my prediction. You can come talk to me in June if I'm wrong. But just, again, to put my legal realist hat on, this issue of transgender girls and women playing sports is so salient politically and culturally. Donald Trump ran on this issue. He ran very effectively on this issue. He has made a centerpiece of his administration to crack down on school districts that are allowing trans girls to play on girl sports. And I think that Trump and, frankly, the Supreme Court conservatives, although I don't think they're going to write it in the opinion, believe that public opinion is on their side on this issue. And I find it very hard to believe that this court, which is a very conservative court at the end of the day, is going to issue a ruling that says that transgender women and girls have a constitutional or a statutory right to participate on sports teams that align with their gender identity. That's just me. I may be wrong, and you can come talk to me if I'm proven wrong at the end of the day.
It's an interesting prediction, and I'm not sure I agree with you. We'll see. I mean, I think there's a lot of complications legally. Although you and I, we've talked a lot over the last, several hours throughout the day. One difference you'll see between James and I is like I always approach it like in this super technical lawyer perspective because I'm a geek and that's what I do all day. And James, as a legal journalist, is always thinking sort of meta issues and sort of more the political dynamics swirling around things. And he's not wrong, but I do think a lot of lawyers, and most of the people who sit on the Supreme Court are sort of lawyers. A lot of them, not all of them, right? Are trying to give principled answers based on text that they're struggling with, and for them it's not an overt political effort, and they're not trying to help a president of one party or another. It just may so happen that their ideology leads them to a conclusion that is supportive of one president more than another. I think that's inevitable. The other thing I'll say about the case, and then I'll move on, is that another thing that may be sub rosa here is that the Equal Protection Clause, right, is also lurking in the background because, again, Barrett's concurrence in Skermeti is very adamant that from the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution's perspective, the 14th Amendment, which says, the government shall provide every person the equal protection, guaranteed to every person the equal protection of the laws, has never recognized sexual orientation or much less sort of transgender status as what's called a protected class under the Equal Protection Clause. And if it's not a protected class under the Equal Protection Clause, then it gets what's called rational basis review. And rational basis review is just a geeky way of saying that the person challenging the law has a really tough hill to climb and has to show that the law is utterly irrational, has no rational basis to it whatsoever. And so that usually means those laws get upheld, right? That they're not presumptively unconstitutional, they're presumptively constitutional laws. So I think that's
I tell my students, I always pay attention to the standard of review. So definitely one to watch. We're going to stay on equal protection, but move to elections. And we have a case, Louisiana versus Calais. So James, why don't I start with you on this? So Louisiana drew a map. They're calling it SB 8. So what was map SB 8? Why did Louisiana create it? And then just kind of what are the issues at stake in this case?
I think as we talk about this case, it's nice to remember the introduction, the excellent introduction that Michaela gave. And she said that democracy is practiced through voting. And when we're talking about these technical issues, it's important to remember that the case I'm about to talk about at its bottom is about voting rights, the right to vote, and specifically the right of minority voters to vote in places where there's been a history of discrimination. So that's what this case is about at its core, the power of minority voters to choose their preferred candidates. The Voting Rights Act, passed in the 1960s, a landmark piece of civil rights legislation, prohibited state voting practices that discriminate on the basis of race. And over the decades, that prohibition has been understood and interpreted, including by the Supreme Court, to require states to allow large groups of minority voters to be able to elect their chosen candidates. And what that means in practice is that if a state draws a congressional district map or a state legislative map that dilutes the power of minority voters, that map will be struck down under the Voting Rights Act. And the state will have to draw a new map that enables minority voters to elect their chosen candidates. This has come up many times in many states. The case currently before the Supreme Court began in Louisiana. Louisiana has 6 congressional seats, 6 seats in the House of Representatives. The population of Louisiana is about 30% black voters. But until the 2020 census, Louisiana had only one of its 6 districts represented by a black representative. He was a black Democrat. The other 5 districts were represented by Republicans. That initial map with only one district where black voters had a majority and could elect their chosen candidates was challenged under the VRA, under the Voting Rights Act. And the challengers won. And in order to comply with the Voting Rights Act, the Republican state legislature of Louisiana redrew a new map. They drew a new map where 2 of the 6 districts could be, they drew a new map that had 2 House districts where black voters had a meaningful opportunity to elect candidates of their choice, and in practice that often means black candidates. So that litigation took a few years. Now there's a new challenge to the new map with 2 black districts. And that challenge is brought by a group of white voters who allege that the new map is itself a racial gerrymander, an unconstitutional racial gerrymander, because in order to draw that new map that Louisiana drew to comply with the traditional understanding of the Voting Rights Act, Louisiana had to take race into account. They had to look at the racial makeup of voters. They had to look at where black and white voters were clustered geographically in order to draw those district lines. And the new challengers in the new lawsuits say that's unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, because the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment generally prohibits the government from discriminating on the basis of race. And they say, as white voters, they were discriminated against by this racially gerrymandered map. And this challenge, which will be heard soon, I think actually in the next couple weeks, in the Supreme Court.
October 15th.
October 15th, there you go. Thanks for fact checking
And
me.
it's a re-argument.
And it was already argued once before last term. The justices punted the case. They apparently could not come to a resolution on the core issues in the case, and so they held it over to the new term. They're going to hear arguments again on this fundamental constitutional tension of whether Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which has been understood to require some race-based decision-making in the drawing of district lines, violates this constitutional provision. The Supreme Court, in general, under John Roberts, has increasingly tried to adopt, and succeeded in adopting, I should say, a colorblind version, a colorblind view of the Constitution and the Equal Protection Clause. I think many of the court's conservatives believe that any time the government uses race as a factor in any kind of decision-making, that is suspect under the Equal Protection Clause. And so it's conceivable that the court might say that this traditional understanding of the Voting Rights Act, the need to look at racial distributions of voting and drawing district lines in order to protect minorities' voting power, is itself unconstitutional. And so that's, I think, what the case is about. And I think voting rights advocates, advocates for minority voters, would say that a decision in favor of the white voting challengers here would really hobble the Voting Rights Act and substantially dilute the power of minority voters, not just in Louisiana, but all across America. And on the other side, I think there are strong arguments that this practice of using race to draw district lines is difficult. I think people consider it unseemly. And the Supreme Court, I think, would prefer to be out of the business of policing these gerrymandering cases. And so I think it's a really tough case. And the last point I'd make is that I think the folks who support this sort of colorblind, neutral view of the Equal Protection Clause might say that some racial accounting, racial decision-making might have been necessary in the 1960s when the Voting Rights Act was passed. But I think they would say now, and I'm not adopting this view necessarily, but they would say that we live in a different country in 2025, and what the Voting Rights Act might have required and might have been constitutional in the 60s and 70s and 80s might no longer be constitutional now.
Which is
Elizabeth?
basically what Kavanaugh intimated
Yes.
in Allen versus Wright recently. And what also happened recently in a case called Shelby County, decided by the Supreme Court. How many years ago was Shelby County? At least
2013.
2013, yeah. And where basically the court took the preclearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act and held those to be no longer constitutional. So there's, and a similar phenomenon is going on and just recently happened with Students for Fair Admission, which is the affirmative action case that was decided a couple summers ago, where they basically struck down affirmative action in higher education institutions for admission. And you could kind of see that coming for a long time if you're into con law, because there was a concurrence back in the 70s with Justice Powell in a case called Bakke, where he suggested that diversity might be what's called a compelling interest that might sustain a college or university being able to draw race-based distinctions in admissions, that trying to achieve that diversity, including racial diversity, might allow them to satisfy strict scrutiny. But over time, the court sort of eroded that idea. The last sort of breath, if you will, of affirmative action in higher education was in a case called Grutter, which was a 5-4 decision written by O'Connor. And at the end of her opinion, where she actually allowed the University of Michigan Law School to continue to use race-conscious admissions in law school, she said at the very end, we expect 25 years from now that this will no longer be necessary. In other words, intimating that 25 years from then, the equal protection analysis would be quite different. So there's something about equal protection that is temporally fluid in an interesting way. Now, when it comes to Calais, I'll give full admission. I wrote an amicus brief on behalf of the governor of Louisiana in that case, so I'm definitely sort of biased as a practitioner. But one of the things that was fascinating in writing that brief is that when we were sort of talking about the governor about how he wanted to present his argument, separate from the Solicitor General and the Attorney General who are the technical parties in the case and wrote the main brief, his whole message to us was, make sure you paint the picture of how this is like a ping pong game. And what he meant by that was, if you look back at Louisiana's history, and Louisiana is not unusual, there's a lot of states, especially in the South, that have the kind of the same history here. Over probably 50, 60 years, Louisiana has been involved in this ping pong litigation, where on the one hand, they'll draw their maps and they'll sort of be race conscious, because they're getting a lot of pressure from minority groups. We need 2 minority districts or 3 minority districts or 1 minority district, whatever the case may be. And they do that and they satisfy that group, and they often satisfy that group either because there's already been a lawsuit filed under the Voting Rights Act, right, that they're likely to lose, which is actually what happened in Calais. And so they're trying to satisfy that sort of constituency and ward off that legal liability under the Voting Rights Act. But then as soon as they satisfy that constituency and do that, then they get another group of constituents, in this case the non-African American plaintiffs in Calais, who are saying, well, now that you've given this minority group however many districts it wanted, you're actually engaging in race-based discrimination, what's called racial gerrymandering, And that violates the Equal Protection Clause. So the ping pong is between a statute that seems to require the consideration of race and the Equal Protection Clause that seems to forbid the consideration of race. So it's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't if you're a state. It's really hard to walk this line. And what ends up happening is you're just in court all the time. Yeah. Taxpayer dollars are just flying out the window to lawyers like me trying to litigate these cases constantly, incessantly. We're talking millions and millions and millions of dollars going into this. And so on the other side of Students for Fair Admission, which has very strong colorblind, overtures in it, the question is, can you have a statute like the Voting Rights Act that requires overt consideration of race anymore? Maybe it was okay at the time it was written in the 1960s, but now that things have changed, and in particular where racial discrimination is not as prevalent as it was in the 1960s, although it's still obviously there, and the fact that racial minorities don't necessarily vote as consistently for one group as they used to, what should trump? And, Thomas's position, he's the most sort of ardent spokesperson for this idea, is that, okay, that's easy, right? If the Equal Protection says you have to be colorblind and the Voting Rights Act Section 2 says you have to be color conscious, then under the Supremacy Clause, the Constitution trumps the statute and we're done. And that may be the end result. I don't know. But it wouldn't surprise me because, as you just suggested, the court really wants to get out of this business. And the reason I know that is because, A, it's sticky. It's always just sticky. How many districts should a particular minority group get? And it's not just black voters. It's like, how many districts should Hispanics get? How many districts should Asians get? And then it devolves into this notion of proportionality, that there's almost like proportional representation. If you've got 30% blacks in Louisiana, should blacks have 30% of the congressional districts? What about Hispanics? Whatever percentages they are, if they're 12%, do they get 12% of the districts? And the problem with that is that that's not what the Equal Protection Clause is about. The Equal Protection Clause has always been, because it's focused on persons, it's a personal right. It's not a group right. So it inures to you as an individual. And the Voting Rights Act idea of proportionality in these vote dilution cases seems to be inherently in tension with the individualized guarantee of equal protection. And so that is another reason why they just, I think, probably don't like this whole idea of what Section 2 has evolved into. The final thing I will say is that if you want a clue that they want to get out of this, they recently got out of partisan gerrymandering in a case called Rucho versus Common Cause. And what I mean by that is, how when these state legislators draw these crazy lines, they always do it like if it's a Republican state legislature, they draw the lines to favor Republicans. If it's a Democratic state legislature, they draw the lines to favor Democrats. I mean, look what we're going through now where there's like threats. California is going to gerrymander the Republicans out of California. Texas is going to gerrymander the Democrats out of Texas. Well, all these cases have been coming before the Supreme Court for decades and decades and decades since the Voting Rights Act was passed. And the court in Rucho said, you know what? We can't figure out, there's no constitutional concept that says partisan gerrymandering is bad. Partisanship has been part of our history from day one, and the Equal Protection Clause doesn't protect against partisanship. And you know what? It's okay to partisan gerrymander. It may look unseemly, and some of your constituents may be mad at you, so there may be some political checks on you as a state legislator to not overdo this partisanship in your gerrymandering, but they remove themselves entirely from partisan gerrymandering. You can no longer bring a claim of partisan gerrymandering under constitutional or statutory concepts at the federal level. And it was as sticky as Section 2 is. So that's another reason why I think maybe they're going to pull themselves out of overt race-based consideration. With one caveat, they might say, like a compromise would be, we can allow you to take race into consideration as an overall assessment of traditional redistricting criteria. The only reason I think they may not do that is because it flies in the face of SFA, Students for Fair Admission.
Yeah,
So,
I think the affirmative action cases are a real clue to how the court is going to look at this case.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so now we're going to start to get into the emergency orders docket, sometimes called the shadow docket, the interim docket. It has many different names. And we're going to start out with presidential removal powers. So if you've been paying attention to the news, we are literally just keeping you right up to the moment here tonight. So last week, the Supreme Court added to the docket Slaughter versus Trump about presidential removal of an FTC member. And then just yesterday, Cook versus Trump. And of course, this is the case about Lisa Cook, who's a Fed governor. So it's interesting in itself, but then the Fed dimension adds a whole nother layer. So I'm gonna ask James to set us up and give us some context. But before I do that, I'm gonna just read one quote from Wilcox, which was another emergency case this summer about dismissing leaders of the NLRB and MSPB, where the court tried to distinguish the Federal Reserve, saying that the Federal Reserve is a uniquely structured quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks of the United States. So, James, you don't necessarily have to touch on that immediately, but if you want to just kind of get us started with what's the context, what's been going on with presidential removal, and then maybe we can circle back to some of the Fed issues and whether the Lisa Cook case is different, because it's for cause dismissal versus at will and things like that.
Sure, yeah, I'll try to be very crisp here so we can leave like a lot of time for Q&A. But I think at a very high level, what these cases are about are the independence of federal regulatory agencies. We used to think of these agencies as independent agencies. These are agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the National Labor Relations Board, the Federal Election Commission. Agencies that are housed in the executive branch, they regulate specific areas of policymaking, and for many decades, Congress has long tried to insulate the leaders of these agencies from overt political pressure. Because the idea is that these agencies should be run by multi-member boards serving staggered terms, bipartisan boards appointed by presidents of both parties, and they should be running their policy-making agencies as experts, not as political partisans, and they should have a layer of protection from presidential pressure. And the main way that Congress has tried to insulate these agencies has been enacting federal laws that protect them from summary firings by the president. These laws basically say that the president can fire the leaders of these agencies, but only in very limited circumstances. Generally, this is called a for-cause removal. The president can fire these leaders if he has cause. And cause is usually understood to mean something like gross misconduct or malfeasance in office. But if a leader of the FTC or the NLRB hasn't committed that type of misconduct, the president can't just oust them from their job. That's been the traditional understanding. Donald Trump is challenging that understanding very aggressively. When he came into office, he went on a firing spree. He attempted to oust many of the democratically appointed leaders of some of the agencies that I mentioned, as well as many others. A lot of these cases are being litigated, as you might imagine. The leaders of the agencies are claiming that they have been unlawfully removed because Trump did not even claim that he had any cause to fire them. Trump simply didn't like that they were democratically appointed by Democratic presidents and wanted to oust them from the boards. In a series of emergency appeals that have reached the Supreme Court on its emergency docket, the court has allowed Trump to oust the leaders of these agencies at places like the NLRB and the Consumer Product Safety Commission, at least temporarily, while litigation over their firings proceeds in the lower court. Most recently, Rebecca Slaughter's case came up to the Supreme Court. Rebecca Slaughter was a Biden appointee on the Federal Trade Commission. Once again, Trump tried to oust her. Trump didn't really give a reason, never claimed that she had committed any kind of misconduct, simply said she was fired. Slaughter sued to keep her job. A lower court ruled that she should be able to remain in her job and that the firing was unlawful, citing a 1935 precedent, a case called Humphrey's Executor, which dealt with the same agency, the FTC. And in that case, in 1935, the Supreme Court upheld Congress's power to shield FTC leaders from summary firings by the president. But in the Slaughter case, the Supreme Court is going to revisit that precedent. It has ordered oral arguments for December. In the meantime, the Supreme Court allowed Trump to fire Slaughter. So Slaughter is currently out of the job while the litigation proceeds. And I think all signs point to the Supreme Court being poised to overturn that 1935 precedent, Humphrey's Executor, and expand the ability of presidents to summarily dismiss leaders of most, if not all, executive branch agencies. The Supreme Court has been moving in that direction for quite a while. In a series of cases recently, it's narrowed Humphrey's Executor. It's never explicitly overturned it, but this Rebecca Slaughter case does tee up the question concretely whether Humphreys should be overturned, and I think most of the conservative justices probably are poised to vote yes to that question. That leaves one more side issue, the question of the Federal Reserve. A lot of people think the Fed needs to be treated differently because the Fed has so much impact on the economy, and many economists are fearful that if the president has control over who sits on the Fed and can fire people on the Fed at any time and install loyalists on the Fed, there could be very serious ramifications for the economy because presidents will have an incentive to manipulate the economy for political and electoral reasons. And indeed, Trump, just recently, as you may have heard, has attempted to fire Lisa Cook, a Biden-appointed member of the Federal Reserve. That firing is a little different. In that case, he did provide a reason, unlike his other firings of other agency heads. The reason is that she supposedly committed mortgage fraud when she allegedly listed 2 different homes as primary residences on 2 mortgage applications in short succession. Trump has made that allegation. It is uncorroborated. It has never been tested in court. And in fact, just recently, Reuters had some reporting. They unearthed some documents that seem to show that, at least according to these documents, Cook did not actually list 2 different primary residences on 2 mortgage applications. The facts are uncertain at this point. But the key question is how far the Supreme Court is going to go in allowing Trump to have total control over all agencies that are housed in the executive branch. That theory that he should have total control is called the unitary executive theory. And whether the court is willing to extend the unitary executive theory to the Fed, which, as Mark flagged, even some of the justices have signaled recently might need to be treated differently and might need more insulation from political pressure than other agencies. The question is, can the court draw a rational line, a rational, legally sound line for why the Fed might have some degree of protection and why other agencies do not?
Elizabeth, what are your thoughts? Maybe you can tell us a little bit
Oh,
about
so
kind of
many.
the rationale behind the unitary executive theory and then, yeah, just touch on, is the Fed really different? Can they draw that line?
Well, I mean, as I always say, it's not a theory, it's a fact. The Constitution sets forth 3 branches. Article 1 is the Congress, Article 2 is the President, Article 3 is the federal judiciary. The presidency is unique constitutionally because the president, under the plain text of Article 2, is the apex, it's the head of that branch. In fact, there's nobody else in there except the vice president, and even in some of the things he does, he's sometimes the head of the Senate. So he's the only one that's politically accountable directly to the whole nation. He is the chief magistrate, he's the commander-in-chief, he's all of those things, and he has all those powers and he wields them all by himself. That's just what we got out of that constitutional convention. We did not decide to have an oligarchy with, a council of presidents. We got a single president. So it's not a theory, it's a fact. And you compare that to the two other branches. You've got right now 535 members of Congress. And so that institution, that branch of government is not in the hands of one person, it's in the hands of 535 people. And for the federal judiciary, you got that power, that federal judicial power being wielded by, the Supreme Court, which currently is 9 justices plus literally hundreds and hundreds of lower court and circuit court of appeals judges. So the presidency is undoubtedly constitutionally unique. And then you say to yourself, okay, well, once Congress creates these departments, Department of State, Department of Treasury, Department of Defense, War, whatever you want to call it, and these alphabet soup agencies that are supposedly quote unquote independent, FTC, FEC, SEC, CFPB, it's alphabet soup agencies. Once those are created, who do they work for? They work for the president, and only the president, because the president is head of Article 2. And so they belong to his branch. It is his or her branch, once elected president, constitutionally speaking. And so you say to yourself, how can you have pockets of independence from the head of your own branch? It's like creating Swiss cheese, where here, President, here's your constitutional authority under Article 2, but let's put some holes in that Swiss cheese where you can't touch these people and you can't fire them, even though they work for you. And as the Supreme Court called them in the case called Myers in the 1920s, they are your alter ego. Because the president wields tremendous authority under the Constitution, and obviously he can't wield it alone. He has to have what I always call minions, right? You love Despicable Me, right? Little cute little minions. They're all over the place. And they do what they do every day on his or her behalf. They're not independent. There is no such thing in the Constitution as an independence from Article 2. Any more than there would be independence from Congress. Can you imagine there being staffers working for Congress and the members of Congress couldn't fire them? Can you imagine there being law clerks to federal judges, but federal judges couldn't fire their minions, the law clerks? Like, it doesn't make any sense constitutionally. It may make pragmatic sense, right? I think the arguments in favor of quote-unquote independent agencies beginning in the New Deal era, which was the growth of the administrative state, was exactly what you described, which is that, we want to have like these people who are experts and they're sort of nonpartisan, but we know over time that what that's done is distorted separation of powers. What you've done is sort of created little fiefdoms of individuals who wield power sort of separate and independent from the president. That's a problem for Republican theory because they are politically unaccountable to us. And the whole point of our republic is that we have two political branches, the presidency and Congress, and an apolitical branch, the judiciary, which is, we don't elect, and it's hard to get rid of the judges, right? It's only by impeachment. So the two political branches are the ones that we, the people, have control over. And do you really want to have pockets of people who wield tremendous power that we, the people, really can't get rid of? Like, that's not democratic. Republic is really the right word. It's not Republican. I don't know how we ever got ourselves on this path, but I think we got ourselves on this path because there was tremendous political pressure during the New Deal to try to get us out of a depression. So we had to create a giant administrative state to do it, and we did it, and we thought we were doing something good, and we really didn't stop and think, hey, is that even constitutional? Turns out it's really not. There's only one case that says it might be, and that's Humphrey's Executor. But Humphrey's Executor was, the rationale of it was that the FTC exercised what they called no executive authority and only quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial authority. Nobody knows what quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial authority means. There's no such thing constitutionally as quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial authority, much less does the FTC, which is just like every other administrative agency, do they wield that kind of weird hybrid authority. So I think the court is going to overrule Humphrey's executor. You can kind of tell that they're going to because just a few years ago they decided SILA law, which involved a brand new behemoth agency created by Dodd-Frank in 2008 called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB. And after they created this giant new sort of behemoth regulatory agency, they put it outside of any one department, so it was independent, and they had one person head it, a single head director, and they gave that person protection from being fired. That person could only be fired by the president for good cause, and that person served a term longer than the president. So it basically made that CFPB director really insulated from the president, and the Supreme Court said you can't do that. Like, you can't have somebody as a principal officer wielding all this authority of the executive branch and insulated from the head of the executive branch. Just a thought experiment, I'll leave it there. Can you imagine Congress passing a law and saying that the Secretary of State can only be fired by the president for good cause? Or the Secretary of War/Defense could only be fired by the president for good cause? Just posing the question makes you realize that that would be weird, that would be perverted, that would be wrong constitutionally. Now, you may not like that. Maybe you don't like the current president, or you didn't like the past president, or whatever, and so you want people to be insulated from that president. But you know what? That's not the way the system works. You elect a president, the president's head of the branch, and he has the power to fire the people who work for him. Period.
All right. Well, on that note, let's open it up for some Q&A. We certainly have plenty to talk about. Feel free to ask us questions about the Supreme Court in general, things that we've said, cases that we haven't been able to cover. We've got folks going around with microphones, so if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand and someone will come on down.
And we might ask folks to be succinct so that we can try to get it through a few of these.
This is a tariff question. My understanding is that the tariff statute we're talking about either says or implies that the measures the president takes to deal with the emergency have to be related in some way to the emergency and are maybe tied into the emergency. A lot of the tariffs I see, like the one on Brazil, have nothing to do with any emergency. And there's all these across-the-board tariffs. How does that fit in to that variety of tariffs and the overall implications? How does that fit into these Supreme Court cases?
Elizabeth, do you want to take a shot first? And
Sure.
James, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, it's a really good question because the current case that's being litigated, that the Supreme Court's about to decide, is a case involving tariffs that are associated with certain industries for which you can make that connection, right? And a different case with different kinds of tariffs would be looked at legally very different, because legally you say to yourself, exactly as you articulated, okay, do we have a trade imbalance, and is that, sort of an extraordinary emergency? Okay, yes, you can make the argument that it is. It impacts our critical supply infrastructure. It does reduce our national security in certain fields, so that certain tariffs relating to those fields that do have that nexus to national security would likely pass muster under the plain language of the Act. But if you had a different set of circumstances with different kinds of tariffs where that nexus was not clear, it could be a totally different result.
Okay, I think we have another one over here.
So James, you said that when you were talking about the issue at the Supreme Court considering trans women playing in trans sports, you said that Supreme Court might be influenced by public opinion. So that brings up for me a question. So is the Supreme Court influenced by public opinion? And if so, how can we let them know our opinion? And do you think they would care?
What was the last part of the question?
Well, how
know.
can we let them know our opinion? And do you think they would consider it? Do you think they would care?
I can be very crisp. Yes, the Supreme Court cares about public opinion. There are very few ways to make your voice heard before the Supreme Court. You could try filing an amicus brief. I don't think that's going to work. You can try protesting in front of the Supreme Court, which some people do after controversial opinions. The Supreme Court is extremely good at shrouding itself from interactions with the public. The justices very rarely sit for interviews. They very rarely talk to the public. They talk to the public through their opinions. But even these days, increasingly, the Supreme Court has been issuing monumental rulings on its emergency docket and not explaining its reasonings in those emergency appeals. And I think the court has gotten a lot of criticism for that practice. To the original question of whether the Supreme Court thinks about public opinion, I don't think the justices are overtly thinking about that in the front of their minds when they're deciding cases. I really do think the justices believe that they are doing law, applying neutral legal principles. But the fact of the matter is, they, just like all of us, exist in a political and social context, and it is inevitable that those forces affect their psychologies and their decision-making. They have ideologies just like all the rest of us, and they are very well aware that their institutional credibility depends on public belief in the power of the courts. The Supreme Court does not have the power of the purse like Congress. It does not have an armed force like the president. What the Supreme Court has to give it legitimacy is public belief and public integrity. And I think we've seen in polls over the past decade that public trust in the Supreme Court is dropping precipitously. I can point to a lot of reasons for that. Not all the court's fault, by the way, but John Roberts in particular is very well aware of how the public is viewed, and he understands that if public trust in the court drops too low, and if the court needs to get into a direct clash with the presidency, with the president, a president who has at least flirted with potentially defying Supreme Court rulings in the past. If the court is going to prevail in that battle, if it crosses swords with the president, the court needs to have the public on its side. And I think time will tell whether the public will be on the court's side if it comes to that battle.
All right, other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Professor Foley, you described this super bureaucrat that was appointed by FDR and outlasted him, I think. Who was he?
You're talking about Humphrey's executor?
I don't know. I'm very curious.
What did I say? You're using specific terminology, so I'm like, what? Let me put it in the right context. A what? Oh, a CFPB director. Yeah.
Oh.
Consumer Financial Protection Bureau director. Can't remember his name. What was his name? He was a controversial dude, and
that was much more recent.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
very recent. That was part of Dodd-Frank, which was what, 2008? It was right after the financial crisis in 2008, where they created this new administrative agency. And that individual, I can't remember his name right now, but he was, what's his name? Oh, Elizabeth Warren was the principal supporter of the CFPB, yes. And she lobbied very hard. She argued very hard to have a single-headed entity like CFPB. Yeah, and that person, it went all the way to the Supreme Court in silo law, and the court said, you can't give that much power to somebody that the president can't fire. And because it was a principal officer, this was the same constitutionally under the Appointments Clause as the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of whatever. And the only difference with Humphrey's executor, what makes it interesting, is that Humphrey's executor, which allowed this insulation from the president's firing, for the FTC back in the 1930s. Did it because, again, the FTC, they said, exercised quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial authority, which, again, they never really defined, and nobody still to this day knows what it means. But it was a multi-member body, right? The FTC is what, 5 commissioners or 7?
I believe it's 5, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah, I mean, all these sort of multi-member bodies, FTC, FEC, SEC, are usually like 5 to 7 members that have staggered terms and yada, yada, yada. And the question really on the other side of silo law is, does that make any difference? Does the fact that it's 5 members instead of a single head of an agency make any difference? It shouldn't, because again, constitutionally, they are all principal officers rather than inferior officers under the Appointments Clause, which means that in the structure of Article 2, nobody is above them except the president. That's what a principal officer is. And so the FTC, there's nobody above the FTC. That's why they're an independent agency. They're not in a department where the secretary of whatever is above them, and then there's the president. These independent agencies are independent outside of any department, and their only quote-unquote boss is the president. Unlike, for example, the FDA, even though there's a single head of FDA, is not an independent agency because it's lodged within the Department of Health and Human Services, and therefore the Secretary of HHS is the FDA commissioner's boss. But that's not the same with FTC and MSPB and NLRB and all these other multi-member agencies. They are principal officers.
How many more acronyms can we throw at this audience?
I
mean,
It's alphabet soup. It's just, sometimes you just say it's alphabet soup.
All right, we've got one more question here.
Okay, great.
I first want to preface this by saying, like, I'm a behavioral neuroscience major and like an undergraduate student. So like I don't like necessarily understand like the legal like side of things that like I'm asking about here. But I was wondering, you guys are discuss like affirmative action, and really on the basis of like race, or like where we're kind of like having like these really huge like court cases talking about like the diversity, equity, inclusion, whether or not they should be like included in schools. I was wondering about like government entities like the Electoral College or the Senate, for example. Like those, in a sense, I feel like could be considered affirmative action in the way that they include smaller states, I guess, for like giving more representation to like, again, like smaller populations of those states, or smaller states where they have more representation in the legal processes, or who our president is. And so I was like wondering, why are the socio-political perspectives or like the legal perspectives so different on those things? And again, I'm still like, I'm really like new to this, so like.
I can answer that one
Very
really
interesting question,
quickly.
yes.
Yeah, there's 2 reasons. Number 1 is that the Constitution's text allows an electoral college. The Constitution text allows direct election of senators after the 17th Amendment. And so there's no constitutional problem with the Constitution. That's one issue. The second issue is that when we talk about, like, for example, affirmative action in higher education, like that Students for Fair Admission issue, and the issue of DEI, which is related to that in institutions of higher learning, that is a question of what does the Equal Protection Clause mean? Right? Because the Equal Protection Clause just says every person is entitled to the equal protection of the laws. And what the court said in Students for Fair Admission is, well, that means some kind of color blindness, right? And so the way the Equal Protection Clause has always been construed by the court is that race-based considerations are particularly pernicious under a concept of equal protection of the laws because of the history of the Equal Protection Clause in particular, right? Because it's a post-Civil War amendment. And so what that means pragmatically is that for the law, you give what's called strict scrutiny to all race-based classifications, which means that those race-based classifications are pretty much going down. They're pretty much going to be unconstitutional. And so that's why Students for Fair Admission came out the way it did, because it looked at these sort of diversity considerations, which had overt consideration of race, as triggering strict scrutiny. They were race-based classifications, and it was contrary to color blindness.
I would just add, I think the fundamental point you're suggesting or hinting at is a very serious critique of the American constitutional system. There are many serious critiques of the way the Electoral College and the Senate are set up. whether you think that they're right or wrong, like whether they're good policy or bad policy, or it is just a fact of the matter that they overrepresent voters in small states. I mean, that is just the fact of the matter. And you can argue about whether that's good or bad, but they do. The only way to reverse that overrepresentation is to amend the Constitution. It is extremely difficult to amend the Constitution, especially in today's modern political climate, because we're so polarized. And a lot of people think it's a serious problem that we haven't amended the Constitution in many decades, and that there really is no realistic chance of amending it anytime soon. And so in some ways, to quote Chief Justice Roberts, we have a Constitution in some ways, trapped in amber, unable to change, unable to evolve. And some very serious, scholars believe that we should make the amendment process easier to reevaluate things like the Electoral College and the Senate.
But is that a feature or a bug?
Could be both.
Right.
The answer is yes. It can be both.
It's a social charter that we're talking about, and we're a diverse country from sea to shining sea. Florida is very different from California, which is very different from Massachusetts, which is very different from Michigan. We have different characteristics state by state. It's very difficult for a pluralistic society to reach societal agreement to amend its social charter. That's why Article 5 says you got to have 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states to ratify constitutional amendments, because we're not talking about a statute that we're amending. It's a social charter, and it's designed for a pluralistic, diverse society that often cannot agree on things. And therefore, if we cannot agree on certain things, we're not up the creek without the paddle. The answer is that we can either then amend our own state constitutions, which are much usually easier to amend. That's why state constitutions are so long sometimes, like Florida's, got provisions to protect pregnant pigs, for example. So you can either get whatever you want enshrined in your state constitution, or better yet and easier, go to your state or federal legislature and get a majoritarian statute passed. So just because you don't enshrine something in the Constitution doesn't mean you don't have protection for whatever it is. There are other ways in our system to get that. And what that does is it's like a pressure valve. It allows different states and different localities to have sort of different laws that are custom tailored to their culture and their desires, but it may not be a one-size-fits-all solution for the nation, because it may be an issue that's very controversial. Let's take abortion, for example, as a prime example, where you may not want to constitutionalize that because it is something that we've never had supermajoritarian consensus on, and maybe that's a good thing. Like maybe amending the Constitution is not supposed to be easy, especially in a non-homogeneous, pluralistic society. It creates stability, which is one reason why we've been existing. Our Constitution has survived way longer than almost any other Constitution in the world, if not any other Constitution in the world at this point.
Well, such an interesting question to wrap up on. I just want to say, James and Elizabeth, just thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. To the audience, thank you for your attentive participation and excellent questions. And I believe Megan is waiting in the wings, so let me kick it over to her to wrap things up.
Let's give a round of applause to our panel tonight. In some ways, I feel like they were just getting warmed up, and it's a shame that we all have to go home at some point. But what a wonderful evening, and so much, our own personal masterclass here tonight about what we should expect from the Supreme Court. So so glad that you could all join us for that. We do hope to see you at our next program on October 30. The event is called Our American Allies, NATO and the Future of U.S. Power. We have two stellar individuals coming. The two most recent ambassadors or permanent U.S. representatives to NATO, Julianne Smith, who served under President Biden, and former Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, who served under Trump's first term. So please come back on October 30 for that event. But for tonight, enjoy your evening, enjoy some dessert in the exhibition hall, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
All right.